Welcome to this UKLFI Charitable Trust webinar on anti-Zionism as national origin discrimination with Alyza D. Lewin, President of the Brandeis Center for Human Rights Under Law. Recognising anti-Zionist harassment as a form of national origin discrimination is a continuing battle around the world. Many people are discriminated against because of their support for Israel. But in the United States, the Department of Education recently announced a milestone resolution agreement with the University of Vermont in respect to this new form of anti-Semitism. Following complaints of intimidation, harassment, and discrimination targeting students on the basis of their Jewish ethnic identity, and the creation of a hostile environment on campus in which Jewish students were being excluded from university clubs and support groups, it was alleged that the university failed to adequately respond to anti-Zionist harassment and discrimination. The Lewin D. Brandeis Center filed the complaint against the University of Vermont, and I'm delighted that Alyza is here to discuss how this case can serve as a model for global efforts to protect Jews from this modern plague of anti-Semitism. Ladies and gentlemen, please put your questions into the Q&A facility on Zoom for our guest to address after her presentation. Alyza Lewin leads the Lewin D. Brandeis Center. It's a non-profit organization which advances the civil and human rights of the Jewish people and promotes justice for all. She is also a co-founder and partner in Lewin & Lewin LLP, where she has specialized in litigation, mediation, and government relations. Alyza led the successful litigation team representing the Israeli licensee of Ben & Jerry's ice cream in the lawsuit against Unilever, and in 2014, she argued the Jerusalem passport case in the US Supreme Court, which gave American citizens born in Jerusalem the right to list Israel as their place of birth on US passports. Together with her father, Nathan Lewin, she also successfully represented the Boehm family in a landmark civil litigation case establishing the right of American victims of terror to obtain damages under US law against organizations that knowingly provide financial support to terrorist groups. Alyza, it is a pleasure to have you with us. Thank you so much for joining.
Very much, Natasha. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you to UK Lawyers for Israel for organizing and hosting this program. I'm very excited to join you today. So, as you mentioned, I am president of the Lewin D. Brandeis Center for Human Rights Under Law. That is an independent nonprofit. We're not affiliated with Brandeis University. And about a little more than 5 years ago, when I joined the organization as the president, is when I really started talking on pretty much a daily basis to students on university campuses. And I very quickly realized that one of the main problems that we had is that university administrators, and quite frankly, the general public, misunderstood what was going on and what was actually taking place on the university campuses. They mistakenly thought that what they were witnessing and what they are witnessing was a good faith political debate, that on the one hand, you would have a pro-Palestinian community, on the other hand, a pro-Israeli community, and this was a speech issue, and so they stepped back and they would do nothing. But in actuality, overwhelmingly, that's not what's happening on campuses today. Maybe in a very, very small number of incidents, you might have some genuine conversations going on, but overwhelmingly, what is happening on campuses today is a determined, deliberate effort to shame, shun, and marginalize Jewish students, particularly those Jewish students who feel this connection to Israel as an integral part of their Jewish identity. I'll give you some examples. So at the University of Southern California, for example, the Brandeis Center worked and represented a student who was elected to be the student body vice president. And there ended up being a campaign by students at the university who felt that they had to rid the student government of any racist representatives. This was a student who was a young woman who was Jewish. She was very progressive, pro-Jewish human rights, pro-Palestinian human rights, but they decided that she was a Zionist because she believed that Israel had a right to exist. And so therefore they launched a campaign to impeach her Zionist ass, because if Zionists are racist, they're not fit to be our elected representatives. And they even went so far as to schedule an impeachment trial, which was only called off after the Brandeis Center got involved. We have helped a student at SUNY New Paltz, the State University of New York at New Paltz, where there was a Jewish student who created and established a group to empower survivors of sexual assault. It was a remarkable group that was really pushing the university to make positive change and provide greater support for this community. They had hosted different programs and symposium on it. And then, totally having nothing to do with the club that she started, this student published on her own personal Instagram account an infographic that basically said that Jews are an ethnic group that originally come from Israel and that you can't colonize a place that you're from. And her co-chairs in the group saw that personal post and said, that's what you think about Palestine? Well, if that's the case, there's no place for you in this sexual survivor empowerment group. And they kicked her out of the group that she had created, cut her off from the social media accounts, cut her off from the Google Drive, and then launched a harassment campaign on social media, encouraging others to target her, to shun her, and to spit on her, to go after her. She felt so unsafe on campus that she actually had to leave campus for the rest of the semester. And then at Berkeley Law School, for example, there's a story which has made the news internationally, because at the law school at Berkeley, there are now at least 14 student organizations that have adopted a bylaw which says that they will not bring in any speakers that support Zionism. In other words, any Zionist speakers. They're not saying that they won't host any programs on Zionism or Israel. No, they're talking about refusing to bring in any individual to speak on any topic if that person is a Zionist. So they wouldn't bring in a women's group, for instance, at Berkeley Law wouldn't bring in a speaker to talk about abortion rights if that speaker is a Zionist. They wouldn't bring in the LGBTQ group, wouldn't bring in a speaker to speak about gay marriage if that speaker believes Israel has a right to exist. That is, as the dean even of the law school has recognized, a bylaw that would preclude the dean himself and 90% of the student body from speaking at that for any of those groups, because the overwhelming majority of Jews do believe that Israel has a right to exist. And so what it is doing is it is discriminating against Jews because it is barring them from the speaker podium at these organizations. So now, don't get me wrong, there is still, unfortunately and sadly, plenty of the kind of what we consider the traditional or historic anti-Semitism taking place on campuses. You still have the swastikas that appear. You still have the Nazi Jewish conspiracy theory flyers that will show up on campus. You have mezuzahs that are torn down. You have Jewish property that's vandalized. The difference, though, is that when administrators are confronted with that type of anti-Semitism, they tend to recognize it, and usually they act. In addition, oftentimes that type of anti-Semitism, as threatening as it is sometimes felt to be less threatening by the students because it's anonymous. They don't know who posted the swastika. They don't know who put up the flyer oftentimes. But the anti-Semitism that's targeting these students on the basis of their ancestral connection to the land of Israel, that anti-Semitism is often taking place in person, where students are actually being confronted personally by those who are targeting them and who are harassing them. And so it feels to the students also much more threatening. So one of the questions is, how do we get the administrators and the general public to recognize this form of anti-Semitism that's actually masquerading as legitimate political debate when it's not? And so there are two things that administrators need to understand as just a initial matter. One, I found administrators don't understand what anti-Semitism is. And two, they don't understand what Zionism is. So when it comes to anti-Semitism, universities need to understand that while anti-Semitism may be society's oldest hatred, it's actually one of the most difficult to recognize because it morphs. It's a little different in every generation. But there's one constant when it comes to anti-Semitism, and that is that no matter what the generation, no matter what the era, that society takes whatever it feels is its misfortune, whatever's not going well. And what anti-Semitism does is it's a conspiracy theory that blames the Jew. The Jew becomes the scapegoat. The Jew is to blame for that misfortune. And the idea is that, oh, our society would be much better off if not for the Jew. So we need to marginalize. We need to push out the Jew to improve our society. If you even want to try and put some rational basis behind an irrational conspiracy theory, right? So what you see is that historically, whatever the issue is, the Jew ends up being blamed for it. It's a made up conspiracy. So it could be beginning with religion. The Jews were accused of being the Christ killers. Economics, the Jews were, for the communists, the Jews were the capitalists. For the capitalists, the Jews were the communists. When it came to issues of disease, the Jews were accused of being the cause of the Black Death. The Jews were accused of causing COVID. The Jews have been accused. What did the Nazis wish? The Nazis wanted a pure Aryan race. And so the Jews were viewed as the ultimate race polluters. And it's interesting because the Nazis did not consider the Jews white. And yet today, when you think about what our society has deemed some of the greatest evils that need to be confronted, racism, apartheid, colonialism, suddenly all Jews, no matter where they come from, no matter what the color of their skin, are labeled white colonialist oppressors. That's a form of today's anti-Semitism, because again, it's seeking to blame today's evils on the Jew. But there's also a difference today in that we don't only have individual Jews. Today, we actually have a Jewish collective. We just celebrated 75 years of the Jewish nation state of Israel. And so what we see today's contemporary anti-Semitism doing is taking that same approach, the same effort to shun and demonize and delegitimize Jews and push them out, as Erwin Cutler, now the special envoy from Canada to combat anti-Semitism. So as Erwin Cutler once explained, traditional anti-Semitism sought to deny individual Jews their place in society. The current contemporary form of anti-Semitism seeks to do the same to the Jewish collective, to the Jewish nation state. It seeks to deny it its place in the society of nations. So what you see is that there are those who will blame the Jewish collective for today's greatest evil. That's why you have those who will say that Israel, the only democracy in the Middle East, the one place where all faiths, ethnicities, genders, religions are all equal under the law, that's the one place that there are those who will say is the world's worst offender when it comes to today's human rights abuses. It's not China with the Uyghurs or Russia with Ukraine or North Korea or Iran. No, it's that Jewish state that's to blame for today's greatest evils. And why do they do it? They do it because they say that's the only country in the world that has no right to exist, right? They want to push it out, deny it its place in the society of nations. The world, they say, would be a better place without Israel. That is today's contemporary form of anti-Semitism, and yet most people today still don't recognize it as such. And so what's also happening to the Jews is that any Jew that has the audacity to express pride in this connection with the land of Israel, who dares to celebrate the Jews' shared history and ancestry and ethnicity that's connected to the land of Israel, that's used, again, as a justification for shunning, shaming, marginalizing, and excluding the Jew. So now let's talk for a minute about what Zionism is. Zionism, well, let's start with Judaism, right? Judaism is unique because Jews share not only a faith, but we are also an ethnicity, right? We share this sense of Jewish peoplehood and this shared history, right? And our history, our heritage, our culture, our faith, our theology, it's all deeply intertwined with the land of Israel. You can't separate the two. And so when there are Jews who celebrate, right, this shared ancestry, this shared ethnicity, what makes us the Jewish people? We just finished not long ago the holiday of Passover, right? What is that? That's our shared collective memory. We were all once slaves in Egypt. The travels of the Jewish people through the desert and becoming a nation and heading where? To the promised land, to Israel, right? That's our story. That's our roots. And for many Jews, right, recognizing that deep connection of the Jew to the land of Israel, and the fact that for centuries, throughout exile, persecution, Jews have always yearned, have believed that one day there would be the ingathering of the exiles, that one day, right, that they recognize that Israel has always been the ancestral Jewish homeland, and once again, Jews would return there. That is, for many Jews, what they feel is an integral part of what it means to them to be Jewish. And so while it's true, right, that not all Jews are Zionists, by the same token, it's also true that not all Jews are Sabbath observers. And yet, if you ask any Jew who incorporates any kind of Sabbath observance into their life, and there's a wide spectrum of what that looks like, if you ask them why they do it, they'll tell you that that's an expression of what it means to them to be Jewish. By the same token, if you ask a Jew why they feel this connection to Israel, inevitably, they will say it grows out of and is an expression of their pride in their ancestral ethnic heritage that's connected to the land of Israel. And so that it's also an expression of their Jewish identity. So just like you don't have to actually be a Sabbath observer to recognize that discrimination against a Jew who defines their Jewish identities, including Sabbath observance, right, is discriminatory if you're targeting them on that basis. By the same token, you don't yourself have to be a Zionist to recognize that harassing, shunning, marginalizing, excluding a Jew who defines their Jewish identity as including Zionism is also a form of discrimination. So how do we get university administrators to recognize and to act once they see this kind of discrimination? Well, the law is a very powerful motivator. So very few things will get universities to act. They care very much about their finances, don't want to lose the funds. They care about their public image. They don't want very bad publicity, and they want to stay on the right side of the law. So in the United States, Title VI of the Civil Rights Act applies, because Title VI of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 says that basically any institution that receives federal government funds may not discriminate on the basis of race, color, national origin. In other words, it has to make sure, if it's getting federal funds, that the services or the opportunities that that entity is providing are equally accessible to all. You can't have certain students, if it's a university, because almost every single university in the United States receives some kind of federal funds. They have to make sure that all of their opportunities are equally accessible to all students. They cannot have some students being denied that equal educational opportunity. So when you have, like the examples I gave, students who are being pushed out of student government, or students who are being pushed out of student clubs, or students who are being pushed out, right, of different university organizations, denied that same opportunity, universities have to act, or they could lose their government funding, because that's a condition of the funds. There's one catch. In the United States, Title VI does not include religion as a protected category. So the question is, if religion is not included, how are you going to protect the members of these faith-based groups? Because when there's a violation of Title VI, at least in the United States, you can go one of two ways. You could either file a lawsuit in federal court, or what most individuals do, because it's less expensive, they'll take the administrative route and they'll file a complaint with the agency that's providing the funding. So for universities, that is the Department of Education. And the Department of Education has an Office for Civil Rights, which reviews these administrative complaints. So students will file complaints with the Office for Civil Rights in the Department of Education when they feel that the university has not taken adequate steps to protect them from harassment and discrimination, and as a result, they feel that they're being denied the equal educational opportunities. The problem was that back, especially after 9/11, when there were Muslims and Sikhs who were being mistaken for Muslim, who were suffering terrible bullying and harassment in educational institutions, they filed complaints with the Department of Education. And initially, the Department of Education's response, this is back in the early 2000s, was, well, you know, what can we do? We can't do anything for you. You're a member of a faith-based group. That must be religious discrimination, and we don't cover it. Ken Marcus, who was at that point the acting head of the Office for Civil Rights, the acting assistant secretary for civil rights in the Department of Education, he was a civil rights lawyer. He ultimately went on to found the Brandeis Center, but the Brandeis Center didn't exist yet at that point. He said, wait a minute, that can't be. He said, if members of faith-based groups like Muslims, Sikhs, and Jews are being targeted on the basis of one of these other categories that Title VI includes, race, color, national origin, they don't lose that protection just because they also share a common faith. So he actually wrote a Dear Colleague letter setting out this understanding of Title VI. And I've put together a source sheet with links to some of these sources, which I understand that UK Lawyers for Israel will circulate afterwards when they send out a video of this recording. So that 2004 letter made it clear that the Office for Civil Rights in the Department of Education was going to recognize Title VI as protecting members of faith-based groups, even though religion was not a protected category. That was in the Bush administration. In 2010, in the Obama administration, the Department of Justice adopted the same understanding of Title VI and actually made clear, they said, although Title VI, this is a letter that they wrote quoting Ken Marcus's letter, although Title VI does not prohibit discrimination on the basis of religion, discrimination against Jews, Muslims, Sikhs, and members of other religious groups violates Title VI when that discrimination is based on the group's actual or perceived shared ancestry or ethnic characteristics rather than its members' religious practice. And this language about shared ancestry and ethnicity actually came from a 1987 Supreme Court case. It had also been used in the 2004 letter, where the Supreme Court had recognized that Jews, when the Civil Rights Act was initially passed, that Jews were actually considered one of the groups that was intended to be protected by the civil rights law, because the civil rights laws were intended to protect discrimination of quote, identifiable classes of persons who are subjected to intentional discrimination solely because of their ancestry or ethnic characteristics. So by 2010, you already had in the United States both Democrats and Republicans who are recognizing that Title VI, even though it doesn't mention religion, applies to members of faith-based groups like Muslims, Sikhs, Jews, when they're being targeted on the basis of their shared ancestry and ethnicity. What's exciting, and we'll jump now to what Natasha talked about, is that the Brandeis Center filed a complaint with the Department of Education on behalf of students at the University of Vermont. This complaint was basically a complaint that dealt almost exclusively with anti-Zionism. So for example, part of the complaint included a teaching assistant, a TA at the university, who repeatedly and consistently harassed and demonized Zionist students in her public social media tweets. So for example, she once tweeted, and I quote, "Is it unethical for me, a TA, to not give Zionists credit for participation? I feel like it's good and funny. -5 points for going on Birthright, -10 for posting a pic with a tank in the Golan Heights, -2 points just because I hate your vibe in general." Or she went on once and talked about how I'm trying to be, this is another quote from her tweets, "I'm trying to be low key on social media for Ramadan and it's going okay so far, but," redact the name, "keeps sending me Instagram posts from UVM Zionist Instagram accounts and I get the indelible surge to cyberbully and religion goes out the window. I never learn." Or another time she talks about, quote, "the serotonin rush of bullying Zionists on the public domain." And then she had a tweet where she talked about how this is, quote, "the next step is to make Zionism and Zionist rhetoric politically unthinkable. By the way, free trips, both sides discourse, quote, "my family lives in Tel Aviv," those kinds of statements, she was saying, and this continues her quote, politically unthinkable, worthy of private and public condemnation, likened to historical and contemporary segregationist movements. So that was one piece of the complaint. Then there was another part of the complaint that dealt with a very large, in fact, the largest support group on campus was a support group for survivors of sexual assault. And that group posted that they were going to block Zionists from their club. There was also a book club on campus that said that to be part of the book club, you had to pledge no to Zionism in order to be a member of the book club. So these were all part of the UVM complaint. And what happened, as Natasha said just a couple of weeks ago, is that the Office for Civil Rights reached a resolution agreement with the university where they required the university to actually take steps to modify their anti-discrimination policies, to modify their training, to make sure and include this kind of harassment as recognized as a form of national origin discrimination on the basis of shared ancestry. So the key takeaway that I'm hoping this audience will take is that we need to articulate Zionism as an integral component of Jewish identity so that universities, the general public, and others can understand that when you discriminate against a Zionist, for that Zionism is not a political opinion. It's not a viewpoint, right? It is a key part of who they are as Jews. And so you are discriminating against Jews on the basis of their shared ancestry and ethnicity when you're targeting a Jew on the basis of their Zionism. And that is a form of national origin discrimination. And the beauty of the OCR, of the Office for Civil Rights opinion, is that that approach and that theory can be used now by all over the world where you have prohibitions against discrimination on the basis of national origin. So with that, I guess we can open it up to questions and continue the conversation there.
Alyza, thank you so much for that incredible overview of the important work that you have been doing. The US in particular, of course, with the First Amendment, has a context in which the debate about freedom of speech is an incredibly fraught one. To what extent has that factored into either pushback that you've experienced, the work that you're doing, or arguments that you have had to make in contending, in particular, with the protection of Jewish students on campuses?
So you're absolutely right. The First Amendment protects free speech. It protects even hate speech. I often have to explain to students, to parents, that they want to know, well, when can we shut down the hate speech? And I say in the United States, even the hate speech is protected speech. People have a right to say some very horrible, vile, awful things. What the universities have to recognize, and what we at the Brandeis Center push for, is that the universities have to realize and address the hostile environment that speech creates. So in 2010, for example, when the Department of Justice came out and acknowledged that Title VI covers faith-based groups, the Department of Education also issued a long letter explaining what universities have to do when they find this kind of harassment and discrimination. And they said that universities must take prompt and effective steps to end the harassment, eliminate any hostile environment and its effects, and prevent the harassment from reoccurring. Now, put aside the fact that they don't usually do anything prompt and effectively, but one of the things that universities always seem to forget to address is the hostile environment. And what they have to realize is that if you have one group on campus that is repeatedly, consistently, incessantly shunned and shamed publicly and marginalized, if you have, for example, over and over again, the people who are sending the message that Zionists are not welcome, that Zionists should be excluded, that Zionists are racist when they're not, right? When they are spreading these false defamatory allegations about Jews for targeting them on this basis of their shared ancestry and ethnicity, even if it is speech, the universities must, under Title VI, use their own speech to condemn this rhetoric, right? The universities have to speak out, because if they don't speak out and explain to their community why this is anti-Semitic speech, if they don't explain to their community why this is so divisive, why this runs counter to everything the university stands for when it seeks diversity and mutual respect and inclusion, then this anti-Semitic rhetoric is just going to escalate. And we already know, because history has shown, that if you don't call it out, if you don't address it when it's just speech, it escalates into actual violence. And so that's what we need to be pushing for. We need to be insisting and demanding that even when it's speech, that the university call it out in order to address the hostile environment and show support for the community that's being targeted by that rhetoric.
And so far as tools for defining the speech and indeed the harassment and the discrimination are concerned, one of the big debates that continues in the United Kingdom and as elsewhere is over the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism, which has, of course, been widely adopted. There are initiatives to push back on that adoption, either to prevent institutions from continuing to incorporate it into their guidance policies, or indeed to unadopt it in certain cases. What's your experience been grappling with IHRA against some of the alternatives that have been presented and the continuing debates, especially where campuses are concerned?
So I'm really glad that you asked that, because one of the pieces, the key pieces in the, I'll say the progression in the United States has been after we had those 2004 and 2010 Dear Colleague letters, this sub-regulatory guidance was raised to the level of an executive order by President Trump in this executive order on combating anti-Semitism. And what it did is it brought up this understanding that Title VI applies to faith-based groups like Jews when they are being targeted on the basis of their shared ancestry and ethnicity. And then what the executive order did is it linked that. First of all, it expanded it so that it applied to every government agency that gives out funding. So every government agency that's subject to Title VI is covered. And in addition, it said when you are doing an investigation, right, when there's been a complaint alleging anti-Semitic harassment and discrimination, how do you know what anti-Semitism is? We use and we turn for guidance to the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, IHRA definition of anti-Semitism. So what the executive order on anti-Semitism did is it linked Title VI with the IHRA definition. So what that means in the United States is that all those universities, whether or not they actually adopt or don't adopt the IHRA definition, when the Department of Education is investigating, like with the UVM, with the University of Vermont case, the Department of Education is using the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism. So it would behoove the universities to follow the IHRA definition and to utilize it on their own, because when they're going to be investigated, that is what the Department of Education is going to be using. Now, there is, as you have said, this attempt to push back, to try and suggest that the definition silences speech. It does nothing of the sort. It doesn't silence criticism of Israel. In fact, as you know, right, it says explicitly that criticism of Israel comparable to that leveled against any other countries is not anti-Semitic. The IHRA definition does not penalize, punish, silence, anything. All it does is label and define it. So it helps the universities, it helps those who are investigating understand anti-Semitism. Now, the problem with other definitions that have been suggested is that those other definitions have been devised by groups that are deliberately trying to carve out the kind of anti-Semitism that Jewish students on campus are experiencing today, so that that type of anti-Semitism will not be labeled as anti-Semitism. So, for example, what do those other definitions remove? They remove the example that IHRA includes, which says that denying Jews the right to self-determination is a form of anti-Semitism. When Jews say, we believe, right, that Israel is the ancestral homeland of the Jewish people, and that Jews have a right to self-determination in our ancestral homeland, when that is the basis of so much of the harassment and discrimination taking place on campus today, it is essential that there be a definition that recognizes that as harassment and discrimination, as we've just been talking about, right? This is the Zionist part of our Jewish identity. To carve that out, to come up with a definition that excludes that, means that you as a university, you as a society, you as a community are turning around and saying, we're going to let that kind of harassment and discrimination continue. It's like creating, as I say, a big neon sign over the gate that says, you want to engage in anti-Semitism, and we wink, wink, nod, nod, we'll pretend it's not anti-Semitism, drive right through here. We can't do that. that's why the IRA definition is so essential.
And you've mentioned, of course, the executive order. There's a question here that goes specifically to that, which states, what expectations do you have of the upcoming Education Department rule proposal on the Trump-era executive order on anti-Semitism? Are there any reasons to be optimistic or concerned about what those rules might include?
Yes, so the person who's asked that question is talking about how in each of these administrations, we've seen each administration kind of step up the level of protection for Jews. So, right, first we had the 2004 letter, then in 2010, we had not only the Department of Justice letter, but then a very detailed letter from the Obama administration, Department of Education, explaining what steps universities have to take. Then in the Trump administration, they bumped all of this up to the level of executive order. And the anticipation is that the Biden administration will want to continue increasing the protection for Jews and not go backwards. So the hope is, as they have said, that they will ensconce the executive order into a permanent regulation, federal regulation. It would be going backwards to remove IRA from the executive order. So my understanding is that there are those who have been pushing and made that clear. And our hope is that the administration will do that and include IRA in the regulation. I will say that when the Department of Education issued back in January a fact sheet on protecting students on the basis of their shared ancestry and ethnicity, Catherine Lehman, who is the current Assistant Secretary for Civil Rights, she heads the Office for Civil Rights, issued an email together with that as part of her announcement. And in that covering email, she affirmed OCR's, quote, commitment to complying with the executive order. So it's clear that this current administration is complying with the executive order. It was clear because the UVM decision, the resolution agreement that they reached, was the first resolution agreement issued by the Biden administration on campus anti-Semitism. And it's clear, as I say, from that resolution agreement that this administration is taking anti-Zionism seriously, and that they are demanding that the universities recognize it and treat it as a form of national origin discrimination based on shared ancestry, which suggests, right, that they are complying with the executive order. It's still on, it is, the questions and answers regarding it are on the current administration's website, on the Department of Education website. And so it is clearly very much a part of what this administration has been practicing, and our hope is that it will continue to do so when it comes out with the proposed rulemaking.
Well, that is extremely encouraging. At least there's a positive trajectory there. There's a question which relates specifically to the situation in the UK, which asks, do we know how much anti-Semitism under the guise of anti-Israel or anti-Zionist sentiment is prevalent in UK university? And I should perhaps say that I'm not aware of any detailed studies that have been conducted with respect to UK higher academic institutions. There is on the University's UK website guidance on tackling anti-Semitism, practical guidance for universities, which dates from June 2021. And in that, it's worth highlighting that it states universities should consider adopting guidelines on how to respectfully discuss political issues, such as discussions about Israel and the Middle East, without engaging in anti-Semitism. And it suggests some example guidelines which can be found online to be incorporated. It may also assist if we highlight that the CST in the United Kingdom have reported that in recent years, a series of reports have been published regarding experiences of anti-Semitism and other types of discrimination in UK universities. The Institute for Jewish Policy Research has a 2011 National Jewish Student Survey, which found that 42% of respondents had either witnessed or been subject to anti-Semitism since the start of that academic year. And there was also a subsequent Institute of Jewish Policy research paper published in 2016 to do with a qualitative study on the opinions and attitudes of Jewish students in 5 different cities. That suggested that while most students encountered little anti-Semitism in their day-to-day lives, that anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism were very much present in the university context. in particular around discourse, with respect to discourse around Israel. I wonder if you're familiar with similar studies in the United States, and whether they support the relatively positive trajectory that you've just been outlining.
Well, so look, there are studies in the Brandeis Center, even did a study that showed that over half of the students on campus are feeling this pressure to hide their Jewish identity, right? The studies are showing increasingly that Jewish students are afraid to be outwardly recognizable as Jewish. They don't want to wear their Star of David. They don't want to wear a kippah, the skull cap. They don't want to wear even t-shirts that have Hebrew on it, because they say that this makes them targets, because any Jew that's visibly Jewish is automatically assumed to be a Zionist. And what you see is nobody is asking them, right? This is what we have to explain to the universities when they say you need to be able to have an appropriate discussion about these political issues. That's not what's happening on campus. Nobody's asking the students before they expel them from the clubs or refuse even to admit them to the clubs that are engaging in activism on all these issues that Jewish students care about, whether it's women's rights, LGBTQ rights, immigration rights, climate change, any of these issues. What the students are being told is the first thing you have to do is disavow your connection to Israel. That's like telling a Catholic student that they have to disavow the Vatican, or a Muslim student that they have to distance themselves from Mecca, right? It's discriminatory, and it is harassment, and it needs to be recognized as such. And it's not a speech issue. Nobody's asking these students to have a conversation about the conflict. In fact, I'll give you an example. A few years ago at New York University, they issued a BDS resolution, and there were 53 student organizations that represented the entire progressive community on campus that endorsed this BDS resolution. But the BDS resolution, that's the Boycott, Divestment, and Sanction resolution, didn't just call for the clubs to boycott and not buy Israeli products or boycott businesses that were doing business with Israel. It said, we're going to boycott all the pro-Israel groups on campus. We're not going to speak with them. We're not going to co-sponsor events with them. We're not going to engage with them at all. The university actually realized that that was a little problematic. And so they hired a professional facilitator to try and facilitate a dialogue among the representatives of these groups. They brought together these 53 student organizations, and they said, the facilitator said, this is not a debate. We're not here for somebody to try and convince anyone, that's I'm right, you're wrong. No, this is just a dialogue. We're going to go around the room and respectfully listen as people share their feelings, their positions, their thoughts. And what was supposed to be a 1.5-hour dialogue turned into a 2.5-hour discussion about whether the anti-Zionists would even dialogue with the Zionists. They said, we came here because we didn't want to lose our student government funding, but you can't force us to talk to them. And there was one Palestinian student in the room, and he said, I don't understand it. The Jews here seem to want to hear my story, but my allies won't let me tell it. And the same thing happened not long ago, last year, at Tufts University, where the Students for Justice in Palestine announced that they were going to be boycotting all the pro-Israel groups, including J Street. And J Street had co-sponsored events with them in the past and said, why are you doing this? We believe in a two-state solution. We believe in a Palestinian, homeland. And the response was, from Students for Justice in Palestine, we're very happy that students begin their anti-Zionist journey with J Street, but you believe that the colonialist enterprise still has a right to exist, and therefore you too deserve to be boycotted. So what's actually happening on campus is not that dialogue, it's not that debate, it's not that discussion, it is the shunning and shaming and isolation and marginalization of Jews. And that's anti-Semitism. That's no different than when, if you think about it, historically, what did the Nazis do? The Nazis had the Jews all wear a yellow Star of David so that from a distance, you could recognize the Jew and you could shun them. If you walked past them, you might spit on them, but you certainly weren't going to go shopping in their stores or use them for your professionals as your doctors or your lawyers, right? What's happening now? If you dare identify yourself as Jewish, you're to be shunned. That's what's happening. That's anti-Semitism. That's the exclusion that we have to get society to see, because it's excluding Jews on the basis of this integral part of our identity as Jews, our shared ancestry and ethnicity.
Lisa, picking up on that, our conversation so far is entirely properly focused on students. There's a question here that asks if you are able to speak about any experience that you have of difficulties faced by Jewish or Israeli faculty members, or those faculty members who have family members living in Israel, or who also teach in Israel, or faced from their colleagues or within their university's administrators, and what steps, if any, can be taken by such faculty members in terms of finding support or dealing with this.
So yes, the sad thing is that faculty members are most definitely suffering the same hostility. In the United States, that becomes an issue of employment discrimination and a hostile environment in their work area because they're employees as opposed to students on the campuses. So that is a different section of the Civil Rights Act, Title VII as opposed to Title VI. The Equal Employment Opportunities Office, EEOC, would be handling it instead of the Department of Education. But we had a situation, and we see this even more now with the diversity, equity, and inclusion programs. So we've seen this on campuses. We've seen this now also spreading to corporations that have all jumped onto this, I'd say the DEI bandwagon, right? That the way to combat and sensitize our employees to bias and discrimination is to educate them in these DEI programs. The problem is that oftentimes these DEI programs don't recognize Jews as an ethnicity. They don't realize Judaism is more than just a faith, a religion. So they leave them out. They don't talk about Judaism as an ethno-religion. And so they often inadvertently, end up, instead of minimizing or sensitizing people to anti-Semitic harassment and discrimination of Jews, they actually end up fostering a very hostile attitude towards Jews and sometimes reinforce the traditional anti-Semitic stereotypes of Jews. So we've had situations, for example, in a case that we brought at Stanford University, where you had staff who were providing the mental health support to students who needed mental health services at the university. And there was a DEI program that very deliberately decided they were not going to address anti-Semitism. The first thing that they did is they divided all their staff up into racially segregated groups, and they put all the Jews into the white affinity group. So one of the staff whose parents and grandparents had been victims in the Holocaust found it completely and totally unsettling, to put it mildly, to be lumped with white supremacists, right, as white in this affinity group. But when they had a Zoom bombing that included both anti-Semitic swastikas and racially targeting anti-Black imagery, the group decided they were only going to talk about the anti-Black imagery and they would not talk about the swastikas. And when the Jews raised that, or asked about another incident dealing with anti-Semitism, they were told, no, you are Jews, you are powerful, you are rich, you don't need this, we're not going to talk about the anti-Semitism. Well, that reinforces the traditional anti-Semitic stereotype of Jews as rich and controlling and powerful. And so it creates and fosters this hostility towards Jews by also erasing Jewish identity. And we should mention that term because it's now a new term and we're seeing it on campuses and beyond, called erasive anti-Semitism, right? Denying the uniqueness of Jewish identity, denying Jewish history, denying our shared ancestry, denying our heritage, and then denying even the persecution and the history of persecution and discrimination that Jews have experienced, in addition to erasing our history and connection to the land of Israel. So yes, faculty is experiencing that too, and we need to articulate why that's problematic, both for the faculty as well as for the students.
And of course, it continues to be a significant problem here in the UK. Dealing with that cross-fertilization through different jurisdictions, one question here asks, to what extent, if at all, has the Brandeis Center been influenced by English law? Specifically Mandela and Dowell Lee, it's a 1982 House of Lords case I'm sure you're familiar with, and the report of the ECHR on Labour anti-Semitism. Have you seen either of those particular examples or any others have an influence in the discussion in the United States?
So I think that to the extent we're influenced, we see that what happens, it usually happens first in the UK and finds its way to the United States. So whether it's the anti-Semitism, like you say, in the Labour Party, the anti-Semitism even that began on the university campuses, I think it starts and then it comes across the ocean. What I'm kind of hoping now is that we can go in the opposite direction, and that this understanding that we've started to develop in the United States of this as a form of national origin discrimination on the basis of shared ancestry can now go back the other way and help influence the decisions and the opinions and the way that it is dealt with, not only in the UK, but elsewhere around the world, in Canada, right, in Australia, in South Africa, anywhere where you have the understanding that national origin discrimination is prohibited. I would love to see this articulation, as I say, of Zionism as integral to identity, that Zionism is not a viewpoint, it's not an opinion, but that this is a key part of what it means to be Jewish, right? This is our heritage. This is recognizing our history. This is, and individuals can be Zionists, as we've said, and they can be very critical of the current policies of the government of Israel. You just take a look at what's going on in Israel right now, and you see what's happening, right? You can criticize the policies of the government of Israel, but you cannot turn around and demand that a Jew give up what is part of their identity as a Jew. You know, there's a piece by, it's a story, and I want to include this. So many people don't realize that the Ethiopian Jews who were airlifted and rescued by Israel in the 1980s and 1990s and brought to Israel, that community overwhelmingly actually believed that the Jewish temple still stood in Jerusalem. They thought that they'd be rescued and that they'd actually be able to go visit the temple when they got to Israel. And you have to realize that the rescue mission was an extremely difficult journey for the Ethiopians. They actually had to literally walk across the Sudanese desert, hundreds of miles, just carrying whatever belongings they could on their back. Very difficult, very challenging. And thousands of Ethiopians were rescued this way. Sometimes, and there was an article that was written by an Ethiopian woman who was rescued as a child, and it was published around the time of the Jewish calendar of Tisha B'Av, which is the day that commemorates the destruction of the temple, because she was talking about how the Ethiopians actually experienced the destruction of the Jewish temple in their own lifetime. They got to Israel and discovered it was destroyed and were actually devastated by this discovery. So she wrote this piece, and I just want to read one small excerpt of this piece where she says, and I quote, "How strong was our belief in the sanctity of Jerusalem in our homes in Ethiopia. The most powerful educational concept that resonated within children and adults alike in Ethiopia, passed down from generation to generation, was awareness of the need for us to safeguard the purity of our hearts and deeds in order that we would one day be worthy of entering Jerusalem, heaven on earth. The ideal of Jerusalem was the force that provided us with the stamina to persevere during the arduous trek through the desert. It was the dream that kept us going. We wanted to reach it, achieve it. We buried our beloved family members, left possessions behind willingly, and lost them to vicious thieves. We struggled to keep going despite the terrible conditions and the hunger, only because of our goal to reach Jerusalem of gold, and after so many generations, stand at the gates of the Holy Temple." Now, of course, Jerusalem, Zion is another name for Jerusalem. There's your Zionism. But if you think about it, if the Ethiopians lived in communities that were so removed from modernity that they did not know that the Jewish temple had been destroyed in 70 AD, they certainly had not heard of Theodor Herzl and political Zionism. What they're describing here as being transferred from generation to generation, this yearning to make it to Jerusalem, this belief that they had to make it to Jerusalem, that's what made them Jewish, right? They're describing there what was this integral part of their Jewish identity. That's how they understood what their Judaism was, passed down from parent to child, from generation to generation. That's the Zionism that's integral to Jewish identity. That's the Zionism that Jews today are being pressured to shed. That's the Zionism that when Jews are told you're not welcome if you feel that way, that's the Zionism that is harassment and discrimination that now we should all recognize as a form of national origin discrimination.
Alyza, it's certainly the Zionism that's not so widely understood outside of the Jewish community. So thank you very much for that particular contribution. We've had a couple of questions about specific universities that I hope I may put to you. One raises the impression the questioner has that Harvard has become a virtual bastion of anti-Zionism. And the questioner asks what is being done about that. But do you have any particular experiences of Harvard and the situation that's been developing there?
So there are issues at Harvard. We have been working with some students at Harvard. There I see somebody's also posted Columbia. Unfortunately, this is now all over. It's all over the United States. People ask if there are universities that are safe. I can't say that there are any universities that are, exempt or free from this. And the challenge is, right, I'd love if there are students who are experiencing this, or if you know of students who are experiencing hostility on these campuses, they should reach out to the Brandeis Center. You can reach us at info@brandeiscenter.com. We have, on behalf of students at different universities, when it's appropriate, filed these complaints with the Office for Civil Rights. There are several universities that are currently being investigated for failing to protect their students from anti-Semitic harassment and discrimination. There are other universities where we've written letters to university administrators urging them to act. There are situations where we've ended up working with students to just help them in terms of when they go for meetings with administrators, to be able to articulate what's happening in a way that the university will recognize and see the harassment and discrimination. So that's what the Brandeis Center does. So yes, it is unfortunately happening on all these campuses. And when folks reach out to us, we work with the students on those campuses.
And I should say that the small but very dedicated team at UK Lawyers for Israel does very much the same here at university campuses across the United Kingdom, and works closely with student organisations for that purpose. One further question, perhaps if I may put to you, specific to the University of Vermont. We have an individual who asks about a situation which you may be familiar with, of altering the grades of Zionists, as this questioner puts it, in order to ensure they will not be successful in their college career. The question asks what the fate of this particular academic was, but could I also address the issue more generally of grade deflation or particularly harsh criticism for students that may take a pro-Israel stance in their academic writing?
So I'm glad you asked that. So I think that what the questioner is referring to is the teaching assistant who I mentioned, who talked about, would it be ethical for me to give a lower grade to the Zionists, a lower participation grade to the Zionists? And we've seen this not only at University of Vermont, but there was at Johns Hopkins University, a teaching assistant who also, she tweeted a poll asking her students to vote on whether she should fail the Zionist students. And the overwhelming majority of those who responded said, yes, fail them. And then the problem, quite frankly, is I think that the overwhelming majority of the folks who will engage in this kind of horrific conduct really don't have any intent of lowering the grade of the students. They are really doing this, again, to try and rile up the community that's following their social media posts to turn on the Zionists, right? They're making it acceptable for the community to say, yeah, fail the Zionists. And the problem that we have is that universities turn around and they say, oh, well, we'll take a look and see, did they really lower the grades? Oh, they didn't lower the grades, so it's all okay. That's not the way they need to be looking at these comments. They need to be saying, wait a minute, it is never acceptable for certainly anybody in a teaching position who can grade students to suggest or rile up one part of the community, try and turn them on the other part of our community on campus. That's unacceptable. It's intolerable. That is conduct. That's not speech, right? Riling up one part of the community to turn on the other students is conduct. That is unacceptable conduct, and we will have to take action to address that. Right now, the universities don't treat it that way. They need to be looking, again, as we say, going back to the Department of Education letter, they need to be looking at the hostile environment that's created by these tweets when they say, hey guys, is it okay? Is it ethical for me to fail, lower the grades, whatever it is? The universities have to say that pitting one part of our community against another will not be tolerated.
Alyza, we have had so many questions, and I'm afraid we're not going to make it through all of them. They've been flooding in. If I may trespass a little further on your time and put two final questions, we'll run a little over. There's a lengthy question about discussions of these issues in the Jewish community in the United States. And if I summarize it, it asks about divisions in opinion, especially with representative Jewish organizations. To what extent have you found divisions in the community in the United States, perhaps contributing to some of the difficulties in combating this new form of anti-Semitism robustly? Is it something that poses a particular concern, or do you feel that for the most part the Jewish community is supportive of Jewish students on campus and the difficulties that they're facing?
So I think that the truth is, when you look at the last decade, the Jewish community, the established Jewish community certainly, is much more coordinated and speaking together and working together, recognizing this problem and trying to address it in a much better, coordinated, stronger fashion than ever before. The challenges that I will say is that I think some of the most difficult conversations within the Jewish community are between the Zionist Jews and the anti-Zionist Jews. Those, for the students on campus, certainly are the most challenging, difficult conversations. And, when I have engaged in these conversations on my own, what I have tried to explain to anti-Zionist Jews is that I'm not trying to make a Zionist out of an anti-Zionist. If an anti-Zionist, that's how they define their Judaism, that's their choice. All I'm saying is, if you want to engage in a conversation on the policies, on the issues, we can have that very difficult conversation. But anti-Zionists need to understand that shunning or excluding Jews who do define their Jewish identities, including Zionism, that's what goes against what even the progressive anti-Zionists seem to say is the way we need to treat everyone, right? Today's society says, number one, each individual has a right to define their identity as they choose. No one else should be defining their identity for them. And two, we have to respect that choice. We have to respect that identity, and everyone's welcome to come with their full identity to the table. That has to apply also to Jews. And anti-Zionists need to realize that Jewish Zionists need to be able to fully engage in society with their full identity, with their full Zionist identity. And shunning them or marginalizing them, saying that Zionists aren't welcome, that can't be acceptable. If you want to have the conversation about the policies, we can, but you first have to stop shunning and excluding and demonizing the Jewish Zionists on the basis of the way they define their Jewish identity.
And finally, if I may draw a couple of questions together, we've been asked how we can scale the success of the University of Vermont resolution, or how it can be used as a model for other schools. If you might draw together perhaps some lessons or some practical takeaways that we can be able to build on what has been an incredible success, and if I may say, a real significant step forward, not just in the US, but to be able to roll that out to combat the challenges that students and faculty are experiencing at universities around the world. What perhaps might be the big takeaways?
So the first takeaway is start talking about Zionism as an integral component of Jewish identity. Start explaining that this is what it means for Jews to be proud about their ethnic and ancestral heritage, and that to demand that Jews shed that is discriminatory. That Jews have every right to be proud of their ancestral ethnic heritage and to engage fully in society with that pride, openly, right, and safely, and that's what we need to protect. And that is separate and distinct from having a discussion about the policies of the government of Israel. And once you are successful at explaining that, and once you are successful then at articulating how what anti-Semitism does is demonize the Jew, right, using these the traditional anti-Semitic tropes to marginalize and shun the Jew, to blame the Jew for whatever that society's misfortune is, get them to recognize that that's what's happening again, right? That's what's happening today. And that's what we have to work to address, because as we know, if we want to protect our democracies, if we want to protect all those values of mutual respect and inclusion that we hold dear, we have to combat together. It can't just be, it's not a Jewish problem, as they say, right? This is something that society at large has to address and confront, because if we don't, we see what happens. When anti-Semitism eats away at societies, it destroys them. And so we must together recognize the anti-Semitism for what it is. And I will say the Jews have a responsibility, right? We can't be afraid to try and take the space to explain this to people, because we're feeling it, we're seeing it. And if we want to protect our societies, we have to make sure that others see it too. So we have to start talking about how this is part of our identity, explain it to others, demand that space, demand that respect, demand that ability for us to engage fully, proudly, safely, and freely as Zionist Jews today.
Alyza, I can see how your comments are resonating with our audience from the contributions in the chat. I am so tremendously grateful, not just for the time that you have taken to explain some of these important developments today, but also for the work that you have been doing tirelessly, not just, as I mentioned in the introduction, with respect to students on campus, but in all respects, to ensure that anti-Zionism is taken seriously as anti-Semitism, and to combat discrimination and indeed terrorism against Jews. Thank you very much indeed. We hope to have you back to perhaps grapple with some of the questions that we haven't been able to address, but I'm extremely grateful for your time, energy, enthusiasm, clarity, and determination.
Thank you so much. It's been a pleasure to be here, and I'm happy to join you at any time to continue the discussion. Take care.